There is a moment in war when something stranger than bullets decides the outcome of a battle. Not artillery, not tanks, not even numbers. Something older, more primal. Fear of a name. It was the summer of 1943. Along the scorched plains of central Russia, German commanders were receiving intelligence reports that made their hands go cold. A Soviet unit was operating in their sector, a unit with no official designation on Wehrmacht maps, a unit that German soldiers had already begun calling something in hushed, reluctant voices. They called it Rokossovsky'S gang. And when that name appeared on the intelligence board, experienced officers who had fought from Warsaw to Stalingrad did something uncharacteristic. They reinforced their lines, they doubled their sentries. Some quietly requested reassignment. This is not mythology. This is not Soviet wartime propaganda dressed up as history. This is a documented psychological phenomenon. A combat unit whose reputation preceded it so completely, so devastatingly, that it functioned as a weapon before a single round was fired. The question is not whether it happened. The question, the one that has haunted military historians, psychologists, and students of human nature for decades, is why. What made these men so terrifying? What made them so effective? What turned a group of disgraced, stripped-of-rank Soviet officers into the most feared fighting force on the Eastern Front? The answer begins with a number, the 8th Separate Penal Battalion of the Central Front. Say that phrase out loud and it sounds almost bureaucratic. Penal Battalion. In the machinery of Soviet wartime administration, it sounds like a punishment detail. A dumping ground for failures and criminals, men sent forward to absorb bullets so better soldiers could advance behind them. That was, in fact, exactly what most penal units were. The Soviet military system created hundreds of such formations. Strafbody, driven by Order Number 227, the infamous directive known informally as "not one step back." Under that order, officers who showed cowardice, lost equipment, retreated without orders, or simply made catastrophic mistakes in the chaos of war were stripped of their rank and thrown into the meat of the front. Their lives were their debt to the state. Their blood was the currency of redemption. But the 8th was different, fundamentally, structurally, philosophically different. And the man responsible for that difference was one of the most extraordinary military minds the Soviet Union ever produced, Konstantin Konstantinovich Rokossovsky. Before we go further, consider this. Rokossovsky himself had been arrested by the NKVD in 1937 during the Great Purge. He was beaten, interrogated, accused of being a Polish spy. He lost his teeth. He spent nearly 3 years in prison before being released and reinstated, because the Red Army, suddenly facing real war, desperately needed officers who actually knew how to fight. Rokossovsky knew what it meant to be discarded, humiliated, stripped of dignity by a system that saw men as instruments rather than human beings. That experience didn't break him. It gave him a clarity that most Soviet commanders simply did not possess. When Rokossovsky took command of what would become the Central Front, he looked at the penal system differently than his peers did. His colleagues saw the Strafbot as a disposal mechanism. Send in the disgraced men, let them absorb casualties, advance over their bodies. Rokossovsky saw something else entirely. He saw warehouses full of operational talent being wasted. Think about what a disgraced Soviet officer actually was in 1943. He was not a coward who had never fought. He was, in the overwhelming majority of cases, a man with years of combat experience, tactical training, leadership instincts, and an intimate understanding of how war actually works. He had commanded men. He had read terrain. He had made decisions under fire. He had, in many cases, been punished not for genuine cowardice, but for the brutal mathematical realities of a war where sometimes retreat was the only rational option, and the system refused to acknowledge that. These men had something else too, something harder to quantify, but absolutely critical to understand. They had everything to prove. This is the psychological insight at the core of the 8th Battalion's story. And it is one of the most profound observations in the entire history of military psychology. Rokossovsky understood intuitively, practically, with the clear eyes of a man who had himself been discarded and reborn, that a soldier fighting to reclaim his honor fights differently than a soldier fighting out of fear. A man who has been shamed, who has watched his rank stripped from his shoulder in front of his peers, who knows that his family has been told he disgraced himself, that man carries inside him a furnace of motivation that no propaganda poster, no political commissar, no threat of execution can manufacture artificially. It is real. It is volcanic. It does not exhaust itself in the first assault. It burns hotter the longer the battle goes. Rokossovsky built the 8th Battalion around this principle, not as an experiment, not as a theory, as a military tool forged deliberately with the precision of a craftsman who understands his materials. The Germans began encountering the unit in the months surrounding the Battle of Kursk, the largest armored engagement in the history of warfare, a grinding, apocalyptic collision of steel and will that would ultimately determine whether the Wehrmacht could survive on the Eastern Front. The Central Front, commanded by Rokossovsky, held the northern face of the Kursk salient. It was here that the 8th Battalion first stepped into the fire. And here, for the first time, German soldiers began reporting something strange. When they identified this particular unit on the opposing line, when the reconnaissance came back with those unit markers, experienced veterans, men who had fought since 1941, behaved in ways that contradicted their training. They did not hold position and wait for assessment. They reacted. The emotional response bypassed rational military calculation. This is the phenomenon that makes the 8th Battalion more than a war story. It is a case study in how reputation, built through genuine, repeated, documented performance, becomes operationally decisive. Reputation is not soft power. In the right circumstances, reputation is the sharpest weapon in a commander's arsenal. How did that reputation get built? Battle by battle. Action by action. Through a series of engagements that military historians would later study, not just for their tactical outcomes, but for the psychological portrait they paint of what human beings are capable of when given something worth fighting for. Not an abstract ideology, not a fear of punishment, but the specific, personal burn and need to look at yourself in a mirror and recognize someone worthy of respect. The Germans gave them a nickname, Rokossovsky'S gang. They meant it as a slur, something criminal, something irregular, something outside the bounds of conventional warfare. They did not understand that in doing so, they were handing these men the greatest gift an enemy can accidentally give, a legend. And legends, once established in the minds of your enemies, fight for you even when you sleep. The story of how 800 disgraced Soviet officers became one of the most psychologically devastating fighting forces of the Second World War is not simply a story about courage. Though courage runs through every page of it, it is a story about what happens when a leader understands that dignity is not a luxury, that shame can be converted into something extraordinary, and that the men the system has thrown away are sometimes the most valuable resource the system possesses. It begins with one man's unconventional idea, brought before a dictator who had every reason to reject it, and one calculated, audacious gamble that changed the course of dozens of lives and left a ghost haunting German command tables from Kursk to the banks of the Oder River. This is the story of the 8th Separate Penal Battalion, Rokossovsky's gang, the men who proved that the most dangerous soldier in any army is the one who has nothing left to lose except his honor. There is a particular kind of courage that never appears in combat reports. It does not show up in casualty figures or operational summaries. It leaves no physical evidence on a battlefield. But without it, the 8th Separate Penal Battalion would never have existed, and the Eastern Front might have looked slightly, critically different in ways we can only imagine. That courage is the courage of an idea, specifically the courage to walk into the office of Joseph Stalin with an idea that violated every instinct of the Soviet military establishment, and to argue for it with a straight back and a calm voice. Konstantin Rokossovsky had that kind of courage. He had always had it. It was arguably what had gotten him arrested in 1937, because a man who thinks independently is inherently dangerous to a system that demands uniform obedience. But it was also what made him, by 1943, one of the few Soviet commanders capable of seeing the war not just as a clash of armies, but as a problem in human engineering. How do you build the most effective fighting unit possible from the available human material? How do you take men that the system has categorized as waste and convert them into something extraordinary? The answer Rokossovsky arrived at was elegant in its simplicity and radical in its implications. You treat them like professionals. To understand how revolutionary this was, you need to understand the context in which it existed. The Soviet military system of the 1940s was not subtle in its approach to motivation. The primary tools were fear, ideology, and the blunt threat of consequences. Order 227, not one step back, was not metaphorical. Blocking detachments sat behind Soviet lines with explicit authorization to shoot soldiers who retreated without orders. Political commissars monitored the ideological reliability of officers. Denunciations were common, encouraged, and frequently acted upon with lethal speed. The entire architecture of Soviet military authority rested on the assumption that men had to be driven forward because their natural instinct would be to run. This was not entirely wrong as an observation. Under artillery bombardment, under tank assault, under the kind of industrial-scale violence the Eastern Front produced, the natural human response is absolutely to run. The question is what you do with that observation. The Soviet answer was build a system of consequences severe enough to make running seem more dangerous than staying. The threat behind you has to be worse than the shell in front of you. Rokossovsky's answer was different. He had spent 3 years in an NKVD prison being beaten and threatened, and having his dignity systematically stripped away by exactly the kind of coercive system his military colleagues relied upon. And he had emerged from that experience with a clear, personal, empirically grounded understanding of what coercion actually produces in human beings. It produces compliance under observation, minimum necessary effort, survival behavior. The man being coerced is not asking himself how to achieve the objective most effectively. He's asking himself how to avoid punishment. These are fundamentally different cognitive states, and they produce fundamentally different results in the field. What Rokossovsky wanted to build was a unit in which men were asking the first question, not the second. A unit driven not by the fear of what happens if they fail, but by the hunger for what becomes possible if they succeed. The raw material for this unit was, on paper, the most problematic human resource the Red Army possessed. Officers who had been formally disgraced. Men who had been stripped of their rank in front of their peers, whose names had been entered into the administrative record as failures, whose families had received word that their fathers, husbands, brothers had proven unworthy. In the brutal social calculus of wartime Soviet society, these men were marked. The shame was not private. It was institutional, documented, permanent, unless they did something to erase it. Rokossovsky saw that shame not as evidence of these men's inadequacy, but as the precise source of their potential. He had felt something very similar himself, sitting in a prison cell while the country he had served his entire life processed his name as an enemy. He had not been broken by it. He had been, in a very specific way, forged by it. And he believed, not as an abstract philosophical position, but as a practical military assessment, that he was not unusual in this, that the right conditions could convert shame into fuel in almost any man who had the foundational competence to make that fuel useful. The officers available to him had that competence. This is the detail that gets lost when people think about penal units as punishment details. The men assigned to the 8th Battalion were not untrained civilians or political prisoners who had never held a rifle. They were former majors, captains, lieutenants, men who had been through the Soviet military academy system, who had led platoons and companies, who understood map reading and defensive positioning and the coordination of fire and movement. They had been in battles. They had made decisions that cost lives, sometimes the wrong decisions, and the system had punished them for it. But the knowledge, the instinct, the physical and mental training of a combat officer, none of that had been stripped away with the rank insignia. It was still there, sitting inside men who now had every possible reason to use it to its maximum capacity. This was the insight Rokossovsky brought to Stalin. He framed it as a military efficiency argument, and it was genuinely an argument about military efficiency. But underneath it ran a current of something more personal, more human, more uncomfortable for the Soviet system to acknowledge. Rokossovsky was arguing that the way you treat people changes what they are capable of, that dignity produces results that fear cannot manufacture, that a man given a genuine path to redemption rather than simply a longer route to death will walk that path with an intensity that no amount of coercion can replicate. Stalin, to his credit as a pragmatist if not as a humanist, understood the operational logic. The Red Army in 1943 was in a moment of existential pressure. Kursk was coming. The Wehrmacht, though weakened, was still enormously capable. Every fighting unit had to produce maximum output. If Rokossovsky believed he could extract superior performance from disgraced officers by treating them as professionals rather than condemned men, and if Rokossovsky's track record as a commander justified trusting his judgment, then the experiment was worth authorizing. The authorization came, and Rokossovsky moved immediately to the most critical phase of the entire project, the structure of the unit itself. He made decisions that his colleagues considered eccentric at best and dangerously sentimental at worst. He insisted that officers in the 8th Battalion would not be stripped of their professional authority during operations. Their military expertise would be used, not suppressed. He established that rehabilitation, the restoration of rank and honor, would be awarded for demonstrated valor, not simply for surviving long enough or absorbing enough punishment. This distinction matters enormously. In standard penal units, the implicit bargain was bleed enough, and we might consider giving you back your name. In the 8th Battalion, under Rokossovsky's framework, the bargain was perform with excellence, and excellence will be recognized and rewarded. The system would see you. Your contribution would be counted. He also made a decision about command culture that would prove, in retrospect, to be perhaps the single most important variable in the unit's eventual performance. He forbade the public humiliation of men in the battalion, not as a soft or sentimental gesture, as a tactical decision. Rokossovsky understood that a man who is regularly humiliated by his commanders will redirect a portion of his psychological energy toward managing that humiliation, absorbing it, hiding from it, navigating around it. That energy is not available for fighting. A man who is treated with professional respect, whose expertise is acknowledged even while his transgression is remembered, directs his full psychological capacity toward the mission. Rokossovsky wanted full capacity. He got rid of anything that drained it. The man he chose to help him implement this vision on the ground was Alexander Gorbachev, and the choice was characteristically deliberate. Gorbachev had his own history with the NKVD. He too had been arrested, imprisoned, subjected to the machinery of Soviet institutional punishment. He too had come out the other side, not broken, but sharpened. When Gorbachev looked at the men of the 8th Battalion, he did not see criminals or failures. He saw mirrors. He recognized in their situation something he had personally navigated, and that recognition fundamentally shaped how he led them. Where other commanders in similar positions maintained distance, the professional separation of the officer class from the condemned men they were nominally leading, Gorbachev engaged directly. He learned names. He asked about previous postings, previous battles, what had gone wrong and why. He conducted himself in a way that communicated, without ever stating it explicitly, that he saw these men as soldiers first and penal cases second. The effect on unit cohesion was, by all available accounts, immediate and profound. By the time the 8th Battalion took its first positions on the northern face of the Kursk salient in the summer of 1943, it was already a fundamentally different kind of unit than anything the Soviet military system had previously produced. Not because the men in it were supernatural, not because they had been given better weapons or more supplies or superior tactical support, but because of the invisible architecture Rokossovsky and Gorbachev had constructed around them, a framework of dignity, professional respect, genuine possibility of redemption, and leadership that treated their expertise as an asset rather than an inconvenience. The Germans had no intelligence on any of this. They would learn about it the hard way, in the trenches and on the hillsides, and in the burning fields outside a small railway station called Ponyri, where the 8th Battalion would face its first genuine test under conditions so brutal that they would have broken almost any other unit in any other army. Rokossovsky's gamble was about to meet reality, and reality, as it turned out, was going to confirm everything he had believed. The railway station at Ponyri does not appear in most Western histories of the Second World War. It sits in the shadow of larger, more cinematic names: Stalingrad, Leningrad, Berlin. But among the men who fought on the northern face of the Kursk salient in July of 1943, Ponyri was not a footnote. It was a furnace. Soviet commanders who survived it later described the fighting there as more concentrated, more savage, more mechanically relentless than almost anything else the Eastern Front produced. The Germans called it the Stalingrad of the Kursk salient. They meant it as a military assessment. It was also, without them knowing it, the precise location where Rokossovsky's experiment would face its first and most decisive test. The strategic context matters. Operation Citadel, the German summer offensive of 1943, was the Wehrmacht's attempt to pinch off the Kursk salient, a massive bulge in the Soviet lines stretching roughly 170 kilometers from north to south and up to 100 kilometers deep. If the Germans could cut off the base of that bulge, they would encircle an enormous concentration of Soviet forces and potentially restore the kind of strategic momentum they had lost at Stalingrad. The northern pincer of this attack, commanded by Field Marshal Walter Model, drove directly toward Ponyri. Because Ponyri sat on the rail line connecting Kursk to Oryol, the logistical spine of the entire northern salient. Whoever held it controlled the operational future of the entire battle. Rokossovsky knew this. He had, in fact, anticipated the German axis of advance with remarkable precision, positioning his defenses in depth and preparing a defensive architecture so sophisticated that Model's attack, despite its initial ferocity, would ultimately shatter against it. Into this architecture, the 8th Battalion was inserted not as a reserve or secondary element, but as a critical holding force. They were given a section of line that military planners assessed as one of the highest pressure points of the anticipated assault. This was not accidental. Rokossovsky placed his most motivated, most experienced, most psychologically driven unit exactly where the German pressure would be most intense. On the 5th of July, 1943, the Germans came. What followed in the next 72 hours was the kind of combat that erases the abstract from military analysis and replaces it with something visceral and immediate. German armor, the new Tiger tanks, the Panther tanks making their operational debut, the older but still formidable Panzer IVs, rolled forward in waves supported by mechanized infantry and artillery concentrations that turned the landscape into a shifting geography of craters and smoke. The noise alone was a physical force. Veterans of earlier battles, men who had fought since Barbarossa in 1941, later said that the weight of German firepower at Ponyri exceeded anything they had previously experienced. Other Soviet units along the line bent. Some broke entirely, not from cowardice, but from the simple arithmetic of human endurance under industrial bombardment. When the pressure exceeds a certain threshold, even trained, motivated soldiers reach the neurological limit of what the human nervous system can sustain, and they move backward. It is not a choice. It is a physiological event. The 8th Battalion did not move backward. This requires explanation because it is the central fact of their combat debut, and it cannot be adequately captured by simply stating it. These men held a position under conditions that forced adjacent units to give ground, under bombardment that physically rearrange the terrain they were defending against armored assaults that should, by any conventional military calculation, have overwhelmed a unit of their size. They held it with casualties that, in any other context, would have triggered an automatic withdrawal order. They held it through the loss of officers, through the collapse of communications, through the particular nightmare of armored infantry assault where tanks breach the perimeter, and suddenly the fighting is not at range but intimate and immediate, and the training and instinct of individual soldiers becomes the only remaining variable. Why? The answer circles back to everything Rokossovsky had built into the unit's foundation, but at Ponyri it manifested in a specific, observable way. When an officer went down, another stepped forward without waiting for orders. Not because they had been told to, because they were former officers themselves, men who understood command instinctively, men who could read a tactical situation and respond to it without the organizational delay that kills units when their leadership structure is disrupted. In a conventional unit, the loss of a company commander creates a command vacuum that can last critical minutes. In the 8th Battalion, that vacuum filled itself almost instantaneously because every man in the unit had at some point in his military career been a commander. The redundancy of expertise was total. The Germans attacking the 8th Battalion's section of line noticed this. Intelligence reports from the period document a pattern of frustrated German assault commanders, noting that this particular Soviet unit responded to casualties not with the expected degradation in effectiveness, but with something that felt from the receiving end like acceleration, as if each loss intensified rather than diminished the resistance of those who remained. This was not suicidal recklessness. The tactical decisions being made were sound, professional, sometimes brilliant. It was the emotional fuel driving those decisions that was abnormal. The furnace of men who had decided, individually and collectively, that this position was where their honor either died or was reborn, and that they would accept no intermediate outcome. By the time the German offensive at Ponyri finally exhausted itself, Model's northern pincer having failed to achieve its breakthrough objectives, the 8th Battalion had held their assigned sector. The cost had been severe. Casualties were measured not in percentages that look manageable on an operational map, but in specific human beings, each one a former officer with a name and a history and a family, and a burning need that would now go permanently unfulfilled. The battalion that emerged from the fighting at Ponyri was smaller. It was also, in ways that are difficult to quantify but impossible to miss in the subsequent record, harder. Word traveled. In the compressed, intense information environment of a major battle, soldiers talk. Commissars file reports. Commanders compare notes. The story of what the 8th Battalion had done at Ponyri moved through the Central Front's command structure with the particular velocity that genuinely extraordinary performance always generates. Rokossovsky received the reports and read them with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose hypothesis has just been confirmed by the most rigorous experimental conditions imaginable. He had believed these men could do this. Now he had evidence, and he intended to use it. The transition from Kursk to the Oriel operation came with the speed that characterizes the best Soviet operational thinking of the war's middle period. The Wehrmacht's failure at Kursk did not produce a static front. It produced a Soviet counteroffensive that the Germans, now off balance and deprived of the initiative they had planned to seize, were poorly positioned to resist. The Oriel operation, codenamed Kutuzov by Soviet planners, drove into the German salient north of Kursk with the objective of taking the city of Oriel and straightening the front line. It was an offensive operation which meant a completely different set of demands on the units involved. At Ponyri, the 8th Battalion had demonstrated that it could hold ground under pressure no one should reasonably have been able to hold. Now the question was whether the same qualities that made them extraordinary in defense could translate into offensive effectiveness. The answer came in the form of a night assault against a fortified height outside Oriel, a position that German engineers had spent weeks converting into a layered defensive strongpoint, with interlocking fields of fire, prepared fighting positions, and the kind of depth that makes frontal assault prohibitively costly even under favorable conditions. Night assaults are among the most technically demanding operations in ground warfare. They require exceptional unit cohesion, precise navigation under conditions of zero visibility, the ability to maintain formation and coordination when the normal visual cues of battlefield awareness are absent, and, perhaps most critically, the willingness to close with a defended position in darkness when the psychological advantages that normally accompany an assault are stripped away and only the cold, specific personal courage of individual soldiers remains. The 8th Battalion took the height on the first attempt. This is the detail that military analysts return to repeatedly when examining the aureole phase of the unit's combat record. Not that they succeeded. Other Soviet units eventually took other German positions in the same operation. That they succeeded on the first attempt at night against a prepared defense with the kind of coordinated speed that suggested not desperate bravery but genuine tactical mastery. The assault was described by Soviet observers as almost surgical. Each element of the attacking force moving to its assigned objective with a precision that reflected officers, not conscripts, executing a plan they had genuinely understood and internalized rather than simply been ordered to follow. The Germans holding that height, when later interrogated, reported that the assault had come so quickly and so quietly, and with such apparent certainty of purpose, that resistance had collapsed not primarily from casualties, but from the psychological shock of facing men who seemed to have no doubt about the outcome. When soldiers defending a position begin to believe the attackers cannot be stopped, the position is already lost. The 8th Battalion had learned to project that quality, not through posturing or noise, but through the simple, devastating communication of absolute commitment that experienced soldiers recognize instantly and cannot easily stand against. After Oriel, the name Rokossovsky'S gang was no longer simply German battlefield slang. It had acquired the specific weight of documented, repeated, verified performance. It was now a military fact. And military facts, once established, have their own gravity. They shape planning, they shape behavior. They shape the calculations of enemies who know they may encounter this unit on the next piece of ground. The 8th Battalion had been tested in the worst possible circumstances and had produced results that exceeded what anyone except Rokossovsky had predicted. They had lost men, good men, experienced men, men whose deaths were not statistics but specific, irreplaceable losses in the fabric of the unit. But they had proven something that could not be unproven. They had demonstrated in the most unambiguous possible language, the language of held ground and taken heights and German assault commanders filing frustrated reports, that Rokossovsky's foundational insight was correct. Dignity produces what fear cannot. Motivation through honor creates soldiers that motivation through coercion cannot replicate. And 800 disgraced men, given the right leadership and the right conditions, and a genuine path back to themselves, could become something that made the most experienced soldiers in the Wehrmacht check their intelligence reports twice and quietly reinforce their lines. The baptism was complete. The Ghost Battalion had become real, and the hardest battles were still ahead. History has a habit of swallowing individuals. The larger the event, the more completely it consumes the specific human beings who lived through it, replacing their faces with numbers, their stories with statistics, their singular, unrepeatable lives with the smooth generalities of operational summaries and casualty reports. The Battle of Kursk involved more than 2 million soldiers. The Oriel operation involved hundreds of thousands. In that scale, it becomes almost impossible to hold on to the individual. To remember that every unit designation on a map represents specific people with specific histories, specific fears, specific reasons for doing what they did on a particular morning on a particular piece of ground. The 8th Separate Penal Battalion is especially vulnerable to this kind of historical erasure, because the institutional instinct of the Soviet system was to minimize the visibility of its penal units, especially when those units performed brilliantly. Acknowledging the extraordinary performance of disgraced men raised uncomfortable questions about the system that had disgraced them. It complicated the official narrative of Soviet military heroism, which preferred its heroes clean and ideologically uncomplicated. And so the individual stories of the men who fought and died in the 8th Battalion were for decades buried under layers of official silence and institutional discomfort. What survives in the historical record, in unit diaries, in regimental reports, in the post-war testimonies of survivors, in the careful archival work of historians who came after, is fragmentary but vivid. 3 stories in particular illuminate not just what these men did, but why they did it and what it cost them and what it meant. The first belongs to Senior Lieutenant Semyon Basov. Basov had been, before his disgrace, a decorated infantry officer, the kind of soldier the Red Army built its self-image around. He had fought from the opening weeks of Barbarossa, had been mentioned in dispatches, had earned the respect of his men through a combination of tactical intelligence and personal fearlessness that marked him, in the eyes of those who served with him, as someone genuinely exceptional. His disgrace came from a decision made in the impossible arithmetic of a losing engagement. In the winter of 1942, a retreat executed without written authorization in circumstances where waiting for written authorization would have meant the annihilation of his entire command. The men survived. Basov lost his rank. By the time he arrived in the 8th Battalion, Basov carried that injustice not as bitterness, or not only as bitterness, but as a specific targeted energy. He had been told, officially and institutionally, that his judgment was not to be trusted. He had decided, with the quiet certainty of a man who knows his own mind, that he would demonstrate the opposite so completely and so publicly that the record could never again be read as anything but corrected. At Ponyri, Basov commanded a platoon holding a forward position on the battalion's right flank, the section of line that received the earliest and heaviest German armored pressure on the morning of the 5th of July. When the first German infantry assault came, supported by armor that had breached the anti-tank ditch to the platoon's left, Basov made a decision that his surviving men later described with a mixture of awe and something close to disbelief. Rather than pulling back to the secondary fighting positions, the tactically correct response to armor breakthrough on an adjacent sector, he ordered his platoon forward into the dead ground between his position and the advancing German infantry. Not a retreat, not a static defense, a sudden aggressive forward movement that placed his men inside the effective range of the supporting German armor, which could no longer fire into the engagement without hitting its own infantry. The Germans, advancing with the confidence of men supported by tanks, suddenly found themselves in close combat with Soviet soldiers who had appeared from the wrong direction at the wrong moment. The psychological shock was immediate and total. Trained soldiers in a prepared assault formation encountering unexpected close-range contact from an unexpected axis default to a survival response before they default to tactical reasoning. Several German soldiers abandoned their positions entirely, not routing in panic, but performing the rapid disengagement that soldiers do when the tactical situation has suddenly and completely ceased to match their expectations. Basov's platoon held its improvised forward position for 4 hours. His company commander, Captain Nikolai Voronin, came forward to reinforce the position and was caught in a German mortar concentration while crossing open ground. Voronin died, ensuring that the ammunition resupply reached Basov's men. By the time German pressure finally forced the platoon back to its original fighting positions, the forward push had consumed the momentum of 2 German assault attempts and bought the battalion's center the time it needed to consolidate against the main armored thrust. Basov survived Ponyri. He survived Oriol. He was formally rehabilitated, his rank restored, his record corrected, before the battalion crossed into Belorussia. He lived to see the end of the war. In his post-war memoirs, brief and characteristically understated, he wrote a single sentence about his time in the 8th Battalion that military historians have quoted repeatedly because it captures something essential. I fought there the way I had always known I could fight, and for the first time in 2 years the Army agreed with me. The second story belongs to Lieutenant Vladimir Yermak, and it ends differently. Yermak was 26 years old when he entered the 8th Battalion. He had been an artillery officer, technically trained, mathematically precise in his approach to both problems and people, known in his previous unit for a kind of calm, methodical competence that made him invaluable in the complex, calculation-heavy world of artillery coordination. His disgrace had come from a targeting error, a single miscalculation under extreme time pressure that sent rounds into a position occupied by Soviet infantry. The error was catastrophic in its immediate consequences and entirely explicable in its origin. Yermak had been working with incorrect map coordinates provided by a liaison officer, and the verification process that should have caught the discrepancy had been bypassed due to the speed of the developing tactical situation. The investigation found the circumstances extenuating. The system punished him anyway because punishment was the system's primary language, and someone had to answer for what had happened. In the 8th Battalion, Yermak served as an infantry platoon commander, a role that used his tactical intelligence but none of his specialized technical training, which was either an oversight or a deliberate decision to ensure that former officers served in genuinely demanding conditions rather than being quietly assigned to roles that matched their previous experience and therefore reduced their personal risk. He adapted to the infantry role with the same methodical competence that had characterized his artillery work. His men, most of them also former officers, responded to his precision and his calm with a trust that formed quickly and ran deep. During the fighting outside Oriel, in the 3rd week of July, Yermak's platoon was assigned to hold a communication trench connecting 2 company positions, a secondary assignment that became primary when German infantry found and exploited a gap in the Soviet line to the platoon's north. The Germans moving through that gap were working their way toward the rear of the battalion's main defensive position, and if they reached it, the consequences would ripple outward through the entire sector. Yermak recognized what was happening before the battalion's communications network had processed the information. He could read the sound of the fighting, the direction of the incoming fire, the sudden appearance of German movement where German movement had no business being, and he understood immediately what it meant. What he did next was reported by 3 separate surviving witnesses and is consistent across all 3 accounts, which is as close to certainty as military history ever gets. He moved his platoon to block the German infiltration route, establishing a hasty defensive position in ground that offered minimal cover and no prepared fighting positions. When German infantry reached the position and found it blocked, the engagement became immediate and close. At a critical moment when the German advance threatened to turn the platoon's left flank and collapse the entire blocking position, Yermak moved to the flank himself, not directing from a command position, but physically moving to the point of greatest danger to ensure it held. He was at that position, personally steadying the flank when a German machine gun found the range. The position held. The German infiltration was stopped. The battalion's rear was preserved. Yermak did not survive to be rehabilitated, to have his rank restored, to write his memoirs, or to hear the war end. He died at 26 years old in an unnamed communication trench outside Oriol, having spent the last months of his life proving in the only arena where proof was still available to him that the system's judgment of his worth had been wrong. He was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The citation was precise and correct about what he had done. It could not be precise about what it had cost him to do it. The specific, unrecoverable weight of a young man's life spent in the service of redemption for a mistake that should have been manageable, in a system that preferred punishment to understanding. The third story is different in almost every respect from the first 2, beginning with the fact that it belongs to a woman. Pelagia Lukyanchikova was not a combat soldier. She was a medical orderly, a sanitar in the Soviet military terminology, attached to the 8th Battalion as part of its medical support element. She was 31 years old, had trained as a nurse before the war, and had volunteered for frontline medical service in 1942 with a matter-of-fact practicality that she apparently brought to most things. She carried no weapon. Her role, as defined by military regulation and common sense, was to reach wounded soldiers on or near the fighting line, provide immediate stabilization, and move them back to the battalion aid station for proper treatment. The regulation said nothing about what Lukyanchikova actually did during the week of heaviest fighting at Poniry, which is perhaps because no regulation anticipated it. In 7 days of continuous combat, Lukyanchikova extracted 47 wounded men from positions that were, at the time of extraction, either under direct fire or within the effective range of German artillery. She did this without a weapon, which meant that every trip forward to reach a casualty was made with no means of self-protection beyond the medical insignia on her sleeve, and the hope that the specific German soldier in the specific position with the specific line of sight to her specific location would honor it. Sometimes they did. Sometimes the ground around her was being torn apart by a fire that recognized no insignia at all, and she moved through it anyway because there was a man ahead of her who was bleeding, and she had decided at some fundamental level below the reach of rational calculation that this was what she was there to do. Her methods were not reckless. Survivors who were among those she extracted describe a woman who moved with deliberate, almost geometric efficiency, reading the ground, timing her movements to the rhythm of incoming fire, using terrain features with the instinctive precision of someone who had spent enough time under bombardment to understand its patterns. She was not brave in the way that gets confused with not being afraid. Every available account suggests she was frequently terrified. She moved forward anyway, consistently, repeatedly, 47 times in 7 days, which works out to slightly fewer than 7 extractions per day in conditions that most people cannot sustain for 7 hours. The men she saved were not abstractions to her, former officers disgraced by a system that had thrown them into the most dangerous assignment available. She knew their histories in the way that medical personnel always come to know the histories of the people in their care, through the particular intimacy of tending to someone at their most vulnerable. She treated them not as condemned men paying a debt, but as patients who deserve to survive. In the moral economy of the 8th Battalion, where dignity was the foundational currency, Lukyanchikova was one of its most consistent practitioners. She was recommended for the Order of the Red Star after Poniry. The recommendation was upheld. She continued with the battalion through Oriel and beyond, and her name appears in the unit records with the quiet regularity of someone doing a job that defies adequate description. These 3 stories, Basov's tactical audacity, Yermak's fatal courage, Lukyanchikova's relentless, weaponless mercy, are not exceptional cases selected to represent the 8th Battalion at its best. They are representative. The unit records contain versions of these stories in number sufficient to establish that what happened at Poniry and Oriol was not the product of 3 remarkable individuals, but of a culture, a specific, deliberately constructed, carefully maintained culture in which self-sacrifice was normal, in which professional excellence was the baseline expectation, and in which the burning need for redemption had been converted, through Rokossovsky's foundational insight and Gorbatyov's daily implementation, into something that looked from the outside like superhuman capability and was, from the inside, simply what it felt like to finally be seen clearly and given the chance to prove it. The Ghost Battalion was made of people. That is the most important thing about it. Not systems, not ideology, not the abstract forces of history. People with names and histories and specific, irreplaceable interior lives, doing extraordinary things because someone had looked at them and decided they were worth the investment of genuine respect. That decision made by one general at one moment in one war echoes forward through every story the 8th Battalion left behind. There is a question that military historians return to repeatedly when they study the 8th Separate Penal Battalion, and it is not the question you might expect. It is not how did they fight so well. The combat record answers that with sufficient clarity. The question that lingers, that refuses to resolve itself into a simple answer is this: what would have happened to these exact same men under different commanders? It is not a hypothetical designed to diminish what the soldiers of the 8th Battalion achieved. It is, in fact, the opposite. An acknowledgement that human potential is not a fixed quantity that expresses itself identically regardless of context. The same person, the same skills, the same interior motivation placed under different leadership in a different organizational culture, surrounded by different assumptions about their worth and their capacity. That person may produce radically different results. The men of the 8th Battalion were extraordinary. But the conditions that allowed their extraordinariness to manifest, rather than being suppressed or misdirected or simply ground down into compliance, were not accidental. They were constructed deliberately and with considerable sophistication by two commanders whose own histories gave them a clarity about human nature that most of their contemporaries entirely lacked. Konstantin Rokossovsky and Alexander Gorbachev were not, in the conventional sense, similar men. Rokossovsky was polished, politically deft, capable of navigating the treacherous social currents of Stalin's military establishment, with a grace that kept him alive and operational through years that consumed dozens of his peers. He was tall, physically imposing, possessed of the particular charisma that attaches itself to people who combine genuine competence with genuine warmth. Soldiers loved him not with the fearful devotion that authoritarian commanders generate, but with the specific, durable loyalty that forms when people feel genuinely seen by the person leading them. He had survived the NKVD, survived the purge, survived everything the system had thrown at him, and emerged not hardened into cynicism, but sharpened into a clarity of purpose that expressed itself in everything he did. Gorbachev was rougher, less polished, a man whose years in the Gulag had left marks that Rokossovsky's prison experience, terrible as it was, had not quite replicated. Where Rokossovsky moved through military society with an almost aristocratic ease, Gorbachev carried the specific gravity of a man who has been at the absolute bottom of what a system can do to a human being and has clawed his way back through sheer, grinding, unrelenting will. He was not warm in the way Rokossovsky was warm. He was fair, rigorously, almost obsessively fair. And in the context of the 8th Battalion, fairness was a form of warmth that the men responded to with something very close to reverence. What united them beneath their surface differences was the experience of having been processed as enemies by the very system they served. Both men knew, not theoretically, not from observation, but from the specific physical, irreversible knowledge that comes from living it, what it meant to be designated a failure by the Soviet state. Both men had looked at that designation from the inside and known it to be wrong, and both had survived long enough to prove it. That experience gave them something that no amount of military education or tactical brilliance could have provided. An unshakable understanding that the system's judgment of a person's worth was not the same as that person's actual worth, and that treating people as if the system's judgment were final was not just morally wrong, but militarily stupid. This understanding manifested in Rokossovsky's leadership of the 8th Battalion in ways both large and small, both structural and daily. The structural decisions, the framework of genuine rehabilitation rather than simply punishment endured, the insistence on using officers' expertise rather than suppressing it, the prohibition on public humiliation, have already been described, but the daily texture of how Rokossovsky engaged with the battalion was equally important and in some ways more revealing. He visited the unit personally, which was not unusual for a front commander visiting any unit, but was notable for the specific quality of attention he brought. He did not inspect. He spoke to men. He asked questions that acknowledged their previous experience, not as an interrogation of their disgrace, but as a genuine professional inquiry into what they had learned, what they had observed, what they thought about specific tactical problems the front was facing. He treated them, in other words, as colleagues whose expertise he valued rather than as condemned men he was graciously permitting to continue existing. The effect of this on unit morale cannot be quantified, but it was, by all available testimony, enormous. When the commanding general of the entire front treats you as a professional worth consulting, The institutional verdict that you are a disgrace becomes considerably harder to sustain as your primary self-definition. Gorbachev implemented this culture at the operational level with the specific attention to detail that daily unit leadership requires. He established a practice that became one of the battalion's defining features: the formal, documented acknowledgement of individual acts of courage and professional excellence, conducted not through the slow, bureaucratic machinery of official commendation, but through immediate, direct, public recognition within the unit itself. When a soldier did something exceptional, Gorbachev made sure the battalion knew about it within hours. Not days, not weeks, hours. Because he understood with the precision of a man who had spent years in a system that never acknowledged his worth, that the timing of recognition matters as much as the recognition itself. Delayed acknowledgement is a bureaucratic formality. Immediate acknowledgement is a human statement. I saw what you did, and it mattered, and you matter. This practice created a feedback loop that military psychologists would now recognize as one of the most powerful mechanisms available for sustaining performance under extreme stress. Men who knew that their actions were being seen and immediately valued directed their energy toward producing actions worth seeing. The culture of excellence became self-reinforcing, not through competition, but through a shared commitment to a standard that the unit had established for itself, and that each individual contributed to maintaining. Against this backdrop, the episode of Colonel Bagration stands out with particular sharpness, because it is the moment when the principles Rokossovsky had built the battalion around were directly challenged, and the moment when Rokossovsky demonstrated that those principles were not decorative but structural, not preferences, but non-negotiable foundations. Bagration was a staff officer attached to the Central Front's operational planning apparatus, competent, conventional, entirely representative of the mainstream Soviet military culture that viewed penal units through the lens of expendability. When a particularly dense minefield was identified as an obstacle to an operational objective in the late summer of 1943, Bagration proposed the solution that the Soviet military system had used for exactly this kind of problem throughout the war. Send the penal unit through it first. Use the men as a human minefield clearance operation. Advance them across the minefield on foot, their bodies triggering the mines, their deaths clearing a path for the units that actually mattered to follow. This was not, within the operational culture of the Soviet military, an unusual suggestion. It was, in fact, relatively routine. Penal units had been used this way throughout the war, and the practice was understood, accepted, and institutionally normalized. Bagration was not proposing something monstrous by the standards of his context. He was proposing something efficient from a certain cold-blooded perspective. Use your most expendable resource to clear an obstacle. Preserve your less expendable resources for the actual operational objective. Rokossovsky removed him from his position the same day. The speed and completeness of Baturin's removal was not an emotional reaction. Rokossovsky was not a man given to emotional reactions and command decisions. It was a deliberate, calculated statement about what the 8th Battalion was and what it was not. A statement delivered not in words, but in the most unambiguous possible institutional language. The immediate relief of a senior officer who had failed to understand the distinction. The men of the 8th Battalion were not a disposable asset. They were a precision instrument. Using a precision instrument as a blunt object is not efficiency. It is waste. And it is the kind of waste that Rokossovsky had built his entire approach to the battalion specifically to prevent. But the Bagration episode also communicated something to the battalion itself. And this may be its most important dimension. Word traveled as word always travels in military units. And the men of the 8th Battalion learned what had been proposed and what had happened to the man who had proposed it. The message was not subtle. Their commanding general had, at professional cost and without hesitation, defended them against an institutional culture that saw them as expendable. He had done it not because it was required of him. No regulation mandated it. No superior had instructed it. But because it was correct and because he had decided before the battalion fired its first shot that he would not allow the logic of expendability to touch these men while he commanded them. The effect of this on the battalion's relationship with Rokossovsky is documented in post-war testimonies with a consistency that speaks for itself. Survivors describe it not as loyalty in the ordinary military sense, the functional adherence of soldiers to the authority of their commander, but as something deeper and more personal. They describe it as the loyalty that forms between people who have been in the most difficult possible circumstances together, who have seen each other's fundamental character tested and found it sound. Rokossovsky had demonstrated his fundamental character to them clearly and at cost. They responded with the specific, durable, nearly indestructible commitment that forms when people feel that the person leading them is genuinely, unconditionally on their side. Gorbatyov's contribution to this dynamic operated at a different register but with equal force. Where Rokossovsky's influence on the battalion was largely structural and symbolic, the general who built the framework and defended it, Gorbatyov was the daily presence who filled that framework with operational content. He was the man who knew which soldiers were struggling, which platoons were developing friction in their leadership structures, which sections of the line were creating the most psychological pressure and therefore needed the most attentive command attention. He carried this knowledge not in reports and summaries, but in his head, because he made it his personal business to know the men he commanded with the specificity that effective leadership at the unit level requires. His rehabilitation decisions, the formal process by which soldiers in the battalion had their rank and honor restored, were perhaps his most significant daily contribution to the unit's culture. In standard penal battalions, rehabilitation was a bureaucratic process driven primarily by time served and wounds received. Bleed enough, survive long enough, and eventually the paperwork would process itself in your favor. Under Gorbatyov, rehabilitation was a leadership decision made case by case, driven by demonstrated excellence rather than the passive accumulation of suffering. A soldier who performed with extraordinary courage in a single engagement could be recommended for immediate rehabilitation. A soldier who showed consistent professional growth, who demonstrated the specific qualities of leadership and judgment that distinguished a good officer from a merely obedient one, could be recommended without waiting for a wound to justify the paperwork. This distinction transformed the entire relationship between the men and the concept of redemption. In the standard penal system, redemption was something that happened to you over time, largely independent of your specific choices and actions. In the 8th Battalion under Gorbachev, redemption was something you could actively pursue through excellence, something that rewarded agency, that responded to initiative, that treated your professional judgment as a variable rather than a fixed quantity to be endured. The men responded to this by exercising judgment, by showing initiative, by making the specific, active, courageous choices that could distinguish them rather than simply surviving until the bureaucracy caught up with their suffering. Together, Rokossovsky and Gorbachev had built something that military history rarely produces with such deliberate clarity, an organizational culture in which the interests of the institution and the interests of the individual were genuinely aligned. The battalion needed men who would perform at maximum capacity in the most demanding conditions available. The men needed a path back to their own self-respect. Rokossovsky had designed a system in which those two needs fed each other rather than conflicting, in which the pursuit of one automatically advanced the other. It was, in the language of modern organizational theory, an elegantly designed incentive structure. In the language of the men who lived inside it, it was simply the first time in years that someone had treated them like they were worth something. The contrast with what the battalion might have been under conventional penal unit command is not hypothetical. It is visible in the record of other units that received similar human material and produced dramatically different results. Disgraced officers placed under commanders who viewed them as condemned men, who managed them through fear and humiliation, who used them as the human tools their institutional designation suggested. Those men performed as people perform when managed through fear. Adequately, sufficiently, not 1 degree beyond what the minimum requirement demanded. The 8th Battalion performed at a level that their own command in general described in a communication to front headquarters as consistently exceeding what could reasonably be expected from any formation of comparable size. The human material was not different. The motivation was the same category of burning need. The difference was entirely in the leadership, in 2 men who had been broken by the system and had used that experience not to replicate the breaking, but to build something its opposite. When the greatest test of the battalion was still to come, the vast operational sweep of 1944, the liberation of Belorussia, the crossing of rivers, and the deep penetration of German-held territory that would carry them from the forests of central Russia to the banks of the Oder. It was this culture, built by these 2 men, that would determine what the 8th Battalion was capable of in its finest and most consequential hours. The Ghost Battalion had been given its soul by Rokossovsky. Gorbachev had made sure it beat steadily, every day, in every decision, in every interaction between commander and soldier, in every moment when the easier path was to treat men as instruments, and the harder path was to treat them as human beings worth the full investment of genuine leadership. They had chosen the harder path, and the Eastern Front, from Kursk to the Oder, would bear the marks of that choice. There are moments in history when everything that has been built, every decision, every sacrifice, every quiet act of leadership, every furnace of personal motivation carefully tended over months of brutal combat, arrives simultaneously at a single point of maximum pressure and either holds or doesn't. For the 8th Separate Penal Battalion, that moment came in the summer of 1944, in the vast operational thunder of Operation Bagration, the Soviet offensive that would, in the span of roughly 2 months, destroy the German Army Group Center more completely than any single military operation in the history of the Second World War. The scale of Bagration is difficult to absorb. It involved 1.2 million Soviet soldiers on the initial assault, supported by 5,000 tanks and more than 5,000 aircraft, driving across a front that stretched nearly 1,000 kilometers from the Pripyat marshes in the south to the forests of Belorussia in the north. The objective was not merely to push the Germans back, it was to annihilate, to encircle, destroy, and eliminate entire German formations so thoroughly that they could not be reconstituted and thrown back into the line. In the summer of 1944, the Red Army had learned, at catastrophic cost over 3 years of the most brutal warfare in human history, how to conduct operations at this scale with the kind of operational sophistication that the Wehrmacht had demonstrated in 1941. Bagration was the proof. Into this colossal machinery, the 8th Battalion was inserted not as a mass formation, but as precisely what Rokossovsky had always intended it to be. A precision instrument deployed for missions that required capabilities the standard Red Army unit structure could not reliably provide. The specific assignment that would define the battalion's final and greatest chapter came from the operational planning staff of what was now Rokossovsky's first Belarusian front, and it was, by the standards of conventional military assignment, extraordinary. Major Dmitry Osipov received his orders in the pre-dawn darkness of late June 1944, in a command post that smelled of pine resin and damp earth, and the particular electric tension that fills the air before large operations. He was 34 years old, a former tank officer who had been assigned to the 8th Battalion after losing his command during the chaotic fighting of 1942, not for cowardice, not for incompetence, but for the specific kind of operational decision that looks like a mistake in the immediate aftermath and looks like the only possible choice when examined with the clarity of distance. He had spent nearly 2 years in the battalion, had fought at Ponyri and Orel, had been recommended for rehabilitation 3 separate times by Gorbachev, and had each time declined it, asking instead to remain with his men until whatever final accounting the war required of them had been completed. His orders were to take a reinforced company, roughly 200 men, deep into the German rear, operating entirely without supply lines or communication with the main Soviet force, for a period not to exceed 10 days. The objective was to locate and destroy the primary German supply columns feeding the formations opposing the main Soviet breakthrough on the central axis. Secondary objectives included the disruption of communications infrastructure, the identification of German reserve positions, and, in a phrase that appears in the operational order with the matter-of-fact brevity that military documents reserve for the most audacious requirements, the creation of maximum operational confusion in the enemy rear area. Osipov read his orders, asked 2 clarifying questions about extraction routes, and said he would need an additional 40 men from the battalion's reconnaissance element. The request was granted. What followed over the next 9 days is documented in Osipov's own after-action report, a document that military historians have described as one of the most remarkable operational records produced by any unit on any front during the Second World War, not for its literary quality, which is functional and precise, but for the sheer density of successful action it records across a sustained period of independent, deep penetration operations. On the second day behind German lines, Osipov's force identified a major supply column moving along a secondary road through forest terrain, trucks carrying fuel and ammunition to the German formations that were at that moment attempting to hold the front against the opening Soviet assaults. The ambush was executed with the tactical precision that had become the battalion's signature. Multiple simultaneous points of contact, immediate exploitation of the confusion created by the opening engagement, rapid seizure of the intact portions of the column before German security forces could organize a coherent response. What happened next reveals something essential about the quality of the men Rokossovsky had built. When Osipov's soldiers examined the captured German equipment, they found among the column's cargo 3 functioning artillery pieces, light field guns that the Germans had been transporting forward for deployment. A conventional raiding force operating on a time-limited penetration mission with no logistical support would have destroyed the guns and moved on. Osipov did something different. He ordered the guns turned around. Former artillery officers, men like Wehrmacht's comrades, men who had spent years calculating firing solutions and directing indirect fire, took control of the captured German pieces and within 2 hours were using them against German targets, firing German ammunition at German positions from a direction that no German operational plan had anticipated or prepared for. The psychological effect on German rear area security forces, already disoriented by the main Soviet breakthrough developing on the front line, was severe. Artillery fire from the wrong direction from positions that should have been friendly territory is one of the most disorienting experiences a military force can have. It means the map is wrong. It means the assumptions underlying every security decision in the area are wrong. It means the rear is not the rear. Over the following 7 days, Osipov's force conducted 4 additional major ambushes, destroyed supply infrastructure at 11 separate points, captured and temporarily held 2 German administrative facilities, and used their captured artillery to interdict 2 major road junctions that served as the primary logistical arteries for German forces attempting to respond to the Soviet breakthrough. The German rear area security response was, by the evidence of German operational records from the period, increasingly frantic, units being diverted from the front to chase a threat that moved faster than pursuit could follow, that appeared where it was not expected and was gone before it could be fixed, that seemed to operate with an intimate knowledge of German logistics and communications, that suggested either extraordinary intelligence preparation or the specific professional expertise of men who had spent careers studying exactly this kind of military system. It was the latter. Former officers who had commanded at battalion and regimental level understood German operational patterns not from intelligence briefings but from the deep professional intuition of men who had studied warfare comprehensively and fought it exhaustively. They knew where supply columns would move because they knew how military logistics worked. They knew where communications infrastructure would be located because they understood how military communications were organized. They were not guessing, they were reading. When Osipov extracted his force on the 9th day, bringing back not just his surviving men but captured documents, prisoners, and detailed operational intelligence about German reserve positions that would prove immediately valuable to front-level planning. The after-action assessment by Rokossovsky's staff used language that military bureaucracies rarely employ. The operation was described as having produced effects disproportionate to the size of the force employed, a precise technical way of saying that 240 men had achieved what should have required thousands, but the cost was real. And the cost matters as much as the achievement. Osipov brought back 161 men. 79 had been lost in 9 days of continuous operation deep in enemy territory, killed in ambushes, lost during extractions, taken by the accumulated attrition of operations that never allowed rest or safety or the ordinary human relief of knowing that the ground behind you was friendly. Each of those 79 men was a former officer. Each carried the specific history of disgrace and burning redemption that defined the battalion's character. Each had chosen repeatedly to move forward rather than back. The liberation of Belarusia continued through July and into August of 1944, and the 8th Battalion fought through it, not always in the dramatic, deep penetration role that Osipov's mission had exemplified, but in the grinding, continuous, brutally demanding combat of a major offensive that never really stopped. Crossing rivers under fire, clearing fortified villages, holding bridgeheads against German counterattacks that came with the desperate energy of an army that understood by now that it was fighting for its survival. It was during this phase in the final accounting that Gorbachev conducted through the late summer of 1944 that a number was established which stands as perhaps the single most powerful testament to what Rokossovsky had built. Of the approximately 800 men who had served in the 8th Battalion across its operational history, from the first defensive positions at Ponary to the deep forests of Belarusia, 600 had been formally rehabilitated, their ranks restored, their records corrected, their names removed from the institutional ledger of disgrace and returned to the ledger of honored service. 600 out of 800, 75% of men that the system had designated as failures had been formally, officially, institutionally recognized as anything but. The rehabilitation rate of the 8th Battalion was, by a significant margin, the highest of any penal unit in the history of the Soviet military. It was not an accident of circumstance. It was the direct, measurable, documented outcome of what Rokossovsky had designed and Gorbachev had implemented. A system that treated rehabilitation as the natural result of excellence rather than the bureaucratic residue of sufficient suffering. The final chapter of the 8th Battalion's story is set on the banks of the Oder River in the early weeks of 1945, as Soviet forces drove toward the German heartland with the unstoppable momentum of an army that has broken its enemy's operational spine and now moves through the wreckage toward a conclusion that everyone, Soviet soldier and German defender alike, can feel approaching with the inevitability of a physical force. A single rifle company from the 8th Battalion crossed the Oder as part of a bridgehead operation that, like all bridgehead operations, required the assault force to establish itself on the far bank and hold it against German counterattacks while the main force prepared to follow. The company crossed, they established their position, and then the German counterattack came. Not a probe, not a small unit response, but a substantial, organized, genuinely dangerous assault designed to push the bridgehead back into the river before it could be reinforced and expanded. The company held, and then, when the German assault had exhausted its initial momentum and the defending force had the momentary, fragile advantage of an enemy temporarily off balance, 13 men launched a counterattack. Not the company. 13 men. The survivors of a unit that had crossed the river at company strength and been reduced by the bridgehead fighting to 13 functional soldiers who without orders, without communication with higher command, without any instruction from anyone in their chain of command, organized themselves and went forward. The German forces facing them withdrew. Trained soldiers in prepared positions, numerically superior by a significant margin, withdrew from 13 men who came forward without hesitation, without apparent doubt, with a specific quality of absolute commitment that the 8th Battalion had been generating since Poniri. The Germans who pulled back in that moment were not cowards. They were experienced soldiers responding to a psychological input that their training and experience told them to take seriously. The recognition that the men coming toward them were operating in a register that conventional military calculation could not easily model or predict. The bridge held, the bridgehead expanded, and when the final accounting of the war arrived in May of 1945, every surviving member of the 8th Separate Penal Battalion was formally and completely restored to their full military standing. Not as a generous gesture, not as a bureaucratic formality, as the documented, evidenced, inarguable conclusion of a process that Rokossovsky had set in motion with a single, unconventional idea brought to Stalin's attention in the spring of 1943. The idea was this, that men who had been discarded by the system were not therefore without value. That shame, properly channeled, produces courage of a quality that fear cannot replicate. That dignity given to soldiers returns as performance that no system of coercion can manufacture. That the men the institution has thrown away are sometimes the institution's most valuable resource, waiting for a commander with the clarity to see it and the courage to act on it. The 8th Battalion proved this idea so completely, so repeatedly, so documentably, that it ceased to be an idea and became a fact. A military fact inscribed in the operational records of the Eastern Front with the same permanent authority as the casualty figures and the terrain objectives and the order of battle assessments. But it is more than a military fact. It is a human fact, and it belongs to a category of human facts that does not age, that does not become irrelevant when the specific circumstances that generated it recede into history. The question of what people are capable of when treated with genuine respect, given genuine opportunity, and led by someone who sees their actual worth rather than their institutional designation. That question does not belong to the Eastern Front of the Second World War. It belongs to every organization, every institution, every relationship where one person holds authority over others and must decide what assumptions to make about the people in their care. Rokossovsky made his assumptions explicit through action. He decided, before a single battle had been fought, that the men of the 8th Battalion were worth the investment of genuine respect. He decided that shame could be converted into something extraordinary if the conversion was managed with intelligence and care. He decided that dignity was not a luxury the war could not afford, but a resource the war could not afford to waste. He was right. The Ghost Battalion was his proof. And the names on its rehabilitation list, 600 names, each one a human being who crossed from one side of the institutional ledger to the other through their own courage and the conditions that made that courage possible, are not just the record of a military unit's performance in a war that ended 80 years ago. They are a permanent argument about what human beings become when someone decides, against every institutional instinct, that they are worth believing in.